There's a moment believers don't talk about. A question appears, and instead of answering it, they push it away. Not because it's hard, because it's too simple, and simple questions can break everything. Today, we're asking 10 of them. If you've ever felt that quiet doubt, this will hit close. Let's start. Would you believe something different if you were born somewhere else? Be honest for a second. Strip away pride, habit, and everything you were taught as a child. If you were born in Saudi Arabia, there is a very high chance you would grow up Muslim, not casually, but deeply convinced. You would pray, follow the rules, and feel certain you were on the right path. If you were born in India, that same certainty would likely be Hindu. In Thailand, Buddhist. In parts of America, Christian. Same brain, same intelligence, same desire to understand life. Different conclusion. So what actually changed? It was not evidence. You did not carefully compare every religion as a child and then logically select the best one like you were picking a phone plan. You absorbed it, quietly, naturally. The same way you learned your language, your habits, even your sense of humor. That creates a problem most people feel but rarely say out loud. If truth is universal, it should not depend on where you happen to be born. Gravity works the same in every country. Mathematics does not change at the border. 2 plus 2 is still 4, whether you are in Riga or Tokyo. But belief does change, dramatically. People often say, "I chose my faith." It sounds strong, like a personal decision. But if you had been born somewhere else, raised by different parents, surrounded by different rituals, would you still have chosen the same thing? Or would you defend a completely different belief with the exact same confidence you have now? And here is where it gets uncomfortable. Billions of people feel just as certain as you do. They pray with the same sincerity. They trust with the same conviction. They would look at your beliefs and feel just as puzzled as you feel about theirs. So what makes your certainty more reliable than theirs? This is not about intelligence. It is not about being sincere. They are just as intelligent, just as sincere. Which leads to a quiet possibility most people avoid. What if certainty itself is not a sign of truth, but a result of conditioning? That thought tends to sit in the back of the mind. It does not shout. It lingers. And once it is there, it changes how you look at everything that comes next. Why does God sound exactly like the culture that teaches him? Take a moment and think about how God is usually described, not in abstract terms, but in practical ones. His values, what he approves of, what he condemns, what he expects from people day to day. Now place that next to the culture you grew up in. The overlap is hard to ignore. In older monarchies, God supports kings and authority. Questioning rulers becomes almost the same as questioning God. In tribal societies, God protects the tribe and often stands against outsiders. Loyalty becomes sacred. In stricter cultures, God becomes strict, focused on rules, discipline, and obedience. In more relaxed societies, God often feels more forgiving, more patient, more understanding. It starts to look less like a universal message and more like a reflection, almost as if God changes shape, depending on who is describing him. That raises a quiet question that people tend to avoid. Are we discovering something external and unchanging, or are we shaping the idea of God using the values we already hold? Because if God were truly independent from human influence, his message would not bend so easily. It would not adjust to social norms or historical periods. It would remain consistent, clear, and the same everywhere. But that is not what we see. Instead, the image of God adapts. It follows culture, politics, and even trends. It softens over time in some places, hardens in others, and sometimes shifts completely depending on what people need or fear. It begins to resemble a mirror. And mirrors do not create anything new. They simply reflect what is already there. So the uncomfortable question becomes harder to ignore. When people worship, are they connecting with something beyond themselves? Or are they reinforcing a carefully shaped version of their own values and beliefs? Because if the voice of God sounds exactly like the voice of the culture teaching it, it becomes difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. And once that line starts to blur, another layer of the question appears. If the image of God reflects us so closely, how much of what we call divine is actually human? That realization does not usually arrive all at once. It builds slowly. And it becomes even harder to ignore when we start talking about where morality really comes from. Would you still be good without religion? This question makes people uneasy, not because it is complicated, but because of where it leads. Many have been taught that morality comes from religion. Remove religion, and everything falls apart. People start lying, stealing, hurting each other. Society collapses like a badly built shed in a storm. But pause for a second. When you choose not to hurt someone, what actually stops you? Is it fear of punishment after death, or something more immediate and human? Because even very young children, long before they understand any religious rules, already show signs of empathy. They feel bad when someone cries. They try to be fair. They recognize when something is wrong. No commandments needed, no threat of hell hanging over their heads. That suggests something important. Morality might not come from religion. It might come from something built into us. Call it human nature, call it social instinct, call it basic decency. Whatever the label, it shows up early and without instruction. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable. If the only reason someone behaves well is because they are afraid of punishment, what does that say about the behavior itself? Is that goodness or just careful self-interest? It is a bit like saying, I would cheat, lie, and steal, but I am worried about the consequences. That is not a moral compass. That is a risk calculation. Like checking the speed limit only when you see a police car. And suddenly, the picture shifts. Because if goodness can exist without religion, then religion does not have exclusive rights to morality. It may reinforce it, shape it, or give it language, but it does not create it from nothing. And once you see that, another question naturally follows. If religion is not the source of morality, then what exactly is its role? Is it guiding something that already exists or claiming ownership over it? That question tends to linger longer than people expect, and it opens the door to something even more sensitive. Why is doubt treated like a crime? Think about how doubt is treated in different areas of life. In science, doubt is the starting point. It is what pushes discovery forward. A scientist who never questions anything is not a scientist for very long. In philosophy, doubt is seen as a sign of depth. It shows you are thinking, not just repeating. But in many religious settings, doubt carries a very different tone. It is not encouraged, it is warned against, sometimes even feared. People are told to trust, to believe, to have faith. On the surface, it sounds noble, almost comforting, like someone guiding you through uncertainty. But look a little closer, and a different picture appears. If something is true, it does not need protection from questions. Truth can handle pressure. In fact, it becomes clearer when challenged, like a solid bridge that holds even when people jump on it. So, why the resistance? Why do some systems treat questions like cracks instead of tools? Because questions do something dangerous. They open doors, and once a door is open, you cannot control where someone walks. That leads to a quiet realization people often avoid. When a system discourages doubt, it may not be defending truth. It may be defending stability, structure, authority. It is a bit like a manager who says, "Do not ask about your salary." The moment you hear that, trust does not increase, it drops. You start wondering what is being protected and why you are not allowed to see it clearly. The same pattern appears here. If faith becomes stronger by avoiding questions, something feels off. Strength usually grows through testing, not avoidance. Muscles get stronger under pressure, not by staying comfortable. So what is being called strength might actually be something else. Something more fragile. Because a belief that cannot survive questions depends on silence to stay intact. And silence is not the same as confidence. It is often just a pause before something breaks. That is where the tension starts to build. If doubt is treated like a threat, not a tool, it changes how you see the entire system. It shifts the question from, "Is this true?" to something more unsettling. "Why am I not allowed to ask?" And once that question appears, it does not leave easily. It pushes further into areas people rarely examine closely. Why does God need worship? Let's think about this carefully. An all-powerful being, infinite, complete, beyond hunger, fear, age, loneliness, insecurity, and bad knees after a long Sunday service. And yet, somehow, this being needs praise. Daily praise, public praise, songs, prayers, rituals, kneeling, repeating, thanking, glorifying, over and over again. That raises a strange question. Why would a perfect being require constant admiration from imperfect humans? Because needing worship sounds very human. It sounds like kings needing subjects to bow. It sounds like leaders needing loyalty oaths. It sounds like people in power wanting constant reminders that everyone knows their place. That does not automatically prove anything, of course, but it does create tension. If God is complete, then worship cannot be for God's emotional needs. A perfect being would not wake up feeling underappreciated. He would not sit around thinking, "Nobody thanked me today. Very disappointing." That would make God less like the source of all existence and more like an elderly uncle waiting for someone to notice he fixed the shelf. So maybe worship serves another purpose. Maybe it is not about God needing praise. Maybe it is about humans being trained into obedience. Because rituals do more than express belief. They shape behavior. Kneeling teaches submission. Repetition builds habit. Public worship creates group loyalty. And once a person connects obedience with goodness, questioning starts to feel like rebellion. That is powerful. It means worship may not simply be a spiritual act. It may also be a social tool. A way to reinforce hierarchy. A way to remind people who is above and who is below. And here is the uncomfortable part. If God truly needs nothing, then worship is not necessary for him. It is necessary for the system built around him. That changes the question completely. Instead of asking, "Why does God deserve worship?" we start asking, "Who benefits when people are taught to worship?" Because the habit of bowing does not stay in temples and churches. It follows people into politics, family, authority, and fear. Once someone learns that obedience is holy, it becomes much easier to control them. And that thought leads to something even harder to ignore. If worship teaches submission, then what else has religion taught people to accept without question? Why are there thousands of religions, but only one true one? Step back and look at the landscape. Not one religion, not two, thousands. Each one with its own story, its own rules, its own version of truth, and not soft truth. Absolute truth. The kind that says, "This is the way," not, "This might be the way." That would be fine if they agreed. But they don't. They contradict each other on core ideas. Who God is, what happens after death, what is right, what is wrong, who is saved, who is not. These are not small differences. They are direct collisions. So logically, they cannot all be right. Now here is the part people feel but rarely say. They can all be wrong. That possibility sits quietly in the background, like a thought you avoid during a long car ride. Because if you believe your religion is true, then you are also saying something else. You are saying that billions of other people are mistaken. Not casual observers, not indifferent skeptics. People who pray every day, people who fast, who sacrifice, who organize their entire lives around their belief. People who feel the same certainty you feel, the same conviction, the same sense that they have found the truth. And still, you would say they are wrong. That creates a tension that is hard to ignore. Because from their perspective, you are the one who is mistaken. Just as sincere, just as convinced, just as sure. It starts to look less like a clear path to truth and more like a pattern. Humans across cultures forming deep beliefs, attaching meaning to them, and defending them with confidence. So now the question shifts. Is belief itself a reliable way to find truth, or is it simply a powerful emotional state that feels like truth? Because sincerity does not guarantee accuracy. History is full of people who were completely convinced and completely wrong. Confident sailors once believed the horizon was the edge of the world. They were not lying. They were just mistaken. If sincerity were enough, every religion would be true at the same time. But they cannot be. So, something else must be happening. Something psychological, something cultural, something that shapes belief before evidence even enters the picture. And once you start seeing that pattern, it becomes harder to ignore. Because it points to a deeper question that most people prefer to leave untouched. Why does faith require you to believe without evidence? This idea is often presented as something admirable. Faith is believing without seeing. It sounds strong, almost heroic, like trusting when others hesitate. But pause and apply that standard somewhere else. In daily life, believing without evidence is not a strength. It is usually a warning sign. If someone tells you they have an invisible dragon in their garage, you do not praise their confidence. You step back a little and wonder what is going on. So, why does the rule suddenly change here? Why is belief without evidence treated as a virtue in religion, but a flaw everywhere else? That shift is worth paying attention to. Because once belief is separated from evidence, something important happens. It becomes very difficult to challenge, not because it is strong, but because it is protected. If there is no requirement for proof, then there is no clear way to test the claim. And if it cannot be tested, it cannot be corrected. It sits outside the usual system we use to figure out what is true and what is not. That creates a strange kind of safety. A belief that cannot be questioned by evidence also cannot be disproven by it. It becomes stable, but not necessarily accurate. Some people respond by saying, "You feel it, you just know." But feelings are complicated. People feel convinced of many things that later turn out to be false. People feel watched in empty rooms. People feel certainty in dreams. People feel fear in complete safety. Feelings can be powerful, but they are not reliable indicators of truth. And yet, in this one area, feelings are often treated as final proof. That is where the tension grows. Because if faith replaces evidence, then belief becomes untouchable. Not strong in the sense of being supported, but strong in the sense of being unreachable. Like a castle with no doors. Nothing can get in, but nothing can be tested either. And once belief reaches that point, a new question begins to form. If we cannot question it, and we cannot test it, then how do we know we are not simply protecting something we were taught to accept? That question does not shout, it settles in quietly. And it leads directly into something even heavier. Why does God allow suffering, but still demand worship? This one does not stay in theory, it lands in real life. Children get sick, people lose everything, wars start, and ordinary people pay the price. None of this is rare. It is constant, visible, and deeply human. And all of it happens in a world that is said to be watched over by an all-powerful, all-knowing, and loving God. That creates a tension people feel but struggle to resolve. A common answer is that it is part of a larger plan, that suffering has meaning, even if we cannot see it. It sounds comforting at first, like there is a hidden order behind the chaos. But take that idea and apply it to a human situation. If someone had the power to stop a child from suffering and chose not to, we would not call that person loving. We would not say, they must have a plan. We would question their character immediately. So why does the standard shift when the subject becomes divine? That is where the discomfort begins. If God has the power to prevent suffering but allows it anyway, it raises questions about goodness, not in a dramatic way, just in a quiet, persistent way that does not go away easily. If God cannot prevent it, then the question changes. It becomes a question of power rather than intention. Either way, the image people hold starts to move. Not collapse, but shift. And when the image shifts, the relationship changes with it. Because love, as we understand it, usually involves protection, care, and a desire to reduce harm when possible. When unnecessary suffering exists alongside unlimited power, the definition of love becomes harder to recognize. It begins to feel distant, abstract, harder to relate to, and then another question quietly appears. If suffering is allowed on such a scale, why is worship still expected in return? Why is gratitude required in a world where so much pain goes unanswered? That does not automatically erase belief, but it complicates it. Because now it is not just about understanding God. It is about understanding the relationship between power, suffering, and devotion. And that brings the question closer to home. Not about the world out there, but about how you would respond if you encountered this idea for the first time. Would you accept this religion if you discovered it today? Set everything aside for a moment. Your upbringing, your family, the traditions you grew up with, all the moments that made this belief feel normal, almost invisible, like the air in a room. Now, look at it from the outside. Imagine you are an adult hearing this religion for the first time. No emotional connection, no childhood memories attached. Just the claims, presented clearly. There are stories of miracles, events that break the laws of nature. There are ancient texts, written in a very different time, asking to be trusted today. There are rules about how to live, what to do, what to avoid. There are promises of reward after death and warnings about punishment. Taken on their own, these are extraordinary claims, so how would you respond? Would you accept them immediately, or would you do what you naturally do with unfamiliar ideas? You would ask questions, you would compare, you would look for evidence. You would keep a certain distance until things made sense. In other words, you would treat it the same way you treat other religions you were not raised in. With caution, with curiosity, with doubt. That is the part people rarely say out loud. Because when something is familiar, it does not feel like a claim. It feels like a given, like something that has always been true, simply because it has always been there. Familiarity creates comfort, and comfort can quietly imitate truth. It feels stable, reliable, unquestioned. But comfort and truth are not the same thing. A worn chair feels right because you have sat in it for years. That does not mean it is the best chair in the room. It just means you are used to it. The same principle applies here. Once you recognize that your belief feels true partly because it is familiar, something shifts. Not dramatically, but enough to change how you see it. You begin to separate what is actually convincing from what is simply known, and once that line becomes visible, it does not disappear easily. It stays there, quietly asking you to look again. And that naturally leads to the final question. What if you're wrong? This is the question that does not make noise. It does not argue. It does not demand attention. It just sits there, quietly, waiting. What if you are wrong? Not a bad person, not foolish, not misled in some dramatic way, just mistaken. That possibility feels uncomfortable because it is so ordinary. History is full of people who were absolutely certain about things we now see clearly as false. They believed the earth stood still. They believed illness came from curses. They believed things that felt obvious at the time. And that is the key part. They did not feel wrong. They felt exactly like people feel now when they are convinced they have the truth, calm, confident, sure of their position. So the question becomes harder to ignore. How do you know your certainty is different from theirs? Because feeling certain is not the same as being correct. The feeling is real, but it does not guarantee the conclusion. That realization does not have to destroy belief. In fact, it can do the opposite. It can refine it. Belief that is honest should be able to face questions without collapsing. It should be able to adjust, to grow, to let go of parts that do not hold up under pressure. Otherwise, it becomes something else. Something that depends on avoiding certain thoughts, certain questions, certain conversations. And that is where things quietly shift. Because if a belief cannot survive honest questioning, then it is not being held together by truth alone. Something else is supporting it. Habit, identity, fear of loss, fear of being wrong. Fear is subtle. It does not always feel like fear. Sometimes it feels like loyalty. Sometimes it feels like certainty. Sometimes it feels like protecting something important. But if fear is what keeps a belief in place, then questioning it feels dangerous, even when it is necessary. And that is why this question lingers. Not because it forces you to abandon anything, but because it invites you to look at your beliefs without protection. And once you do that, even for a moment, you begin to see what is actually holding them together. That is where real clarity begins. These questions are not attacks, they are pressure. And pressure reveals what is actually there. That tension you have felt, that quiet hesitation you pushed aside, that small voice saying something does not fully add up, that was not weakness. That was you thinking. And thinking is uncomfortable, especially when it touches something you were told not to question. But here is the truth most people never say out loud. If something is real, it does not need protection from your honesty. So now you have a choice. Push this away and return to what feels safe, or sit with it, really sit with it, without rushing to defend or explain. Because this is not about losing belief. It is about finding out what survives when you stop protecting it. And that is where clarity begins. If this made you pause, even for a second, do not ignore that. Subscribe, because this is where we keep asking the questions most people avoid. And if you are honest enough, drop a comment. Which question stayed with you the longest? Not the easiest one, the one you cannot shake.